He showed up to her mother's sentencing hearing with his new girlfriend on his arm, wearing a suit Lydia had dry cleaned for him 3 weeks before she found out what he had done. He sat in the second row. The girlfriend, a woman named Brooke, with a shoulder bag that cost more than Lydia's monthly rent, leaned into him and whispered something. He smiled. Not a small smile, a full one. The kind a man wears when he believes the situation is already resolved in his favor. What he did not know, what no one in that courtroom knew except the judge, the prosecutor, and a quiet woman in a gray blazer sitting in the fourth row, was that the real proceeding had already happened. Not here, not in public. In a conference room 7 floors above this building, 6 weeks earlier, where a set of documents had been signed that made everything. Reeves Caldwell thought he controlled into something he could no longer touch. He believed he was watching Lydia Farrow's worst moment. He was watching his own. Chapter 1. The Accountant. Nobody noticed her name was Lydia Farrow. To the partners at Caldwell and Marsh Investment Group, she was simply the CFO who kept the books clean, the woman who arrived before anyone else and left after the cleaning crew, who wore sensible shoes and asked precise questions in board meetings, and never took credit for the quarterly reports that had saved the firm 3 separate times from regulatory scrutiny. She was 41, methodical, and by every external measure, unremarkable. What none of them knew was that Lydia Farrow had built the financial architecture of that firm from a single spreadsheet in a borrowed office 9 years ago, and that the firm they called Caldwell and Marsh operated almost entirely on systems she had designed, processes she had standardized, and relationships she had quietly cultivated with the auditors, the institutional clients, and the compliance attorneys who kept the whole operation legitimate. They did not know this because Lydia had not told them, not out of deception, but because she had learned early that the person who builds the foundation rarely gets invited to stand on it in public. Her mother, Constance Farrow, had spent 32 years as a forensic accountant at the federal level. She had traced embezzlement schemes through 9 layers of shell companies and testified before Congress twice, and never once appeared in a profile or a press release. She operated in the space between what money said it was doing and what it was actually doing. And she had spent Lydia's childhood teaching her daughter to do the same. "You don't announce your work," Connie had said once, when Lydia was 12, and frustrated that a school project she'd organized alone had been presented by the group without crediting her. "You build systems that outlast the people who ignore you. That's the real signature." Lydia had carried that into every professional context she'd ever occupied. She built systems. She documented everything. She made herself indispensable in ways that were not immediately visible, and therefore not immediately threatened. Then she married Reeves Caldwell, and she built his firm too. Chapter 2. The husband, Reeves Caldwell, was the kind of man who could fill a room with confidence before he had said a single substantive thing. He had his grandfather's name and his father's connections, and the precise calibration of charm that Boston's private investment world rewarded most generously. He shook hands, like he remembered everything about you, and asked about your children by name, even when he had to glance at a note card first. He had founded the firm at 30, with family capital and 1 institutional client, and the unshakable certainty that the rest would follow if he performed the role with enough conviction. He was right partly. The clients came. But what held them was not Reeves. It was Lydia's reporting, her risk modeling, her quiet conversations with compliance departments that smoothed over the friction that Reeves's more aggressive positioning regularly created. He understood money as an abstraction. She understood it as a document, and the difference between those two things was the difference between a man who thought he was running a firm and the woman who was actually running it. They had been together 11 years, married for 8. She had joined the firm 4 years into their marriage, at his request, because the CFO they'd hired had left suddenly, and Reeves said he trusted her more than anyone he could find in the market, and that it would only be temporary until they found someone permanent. They never found someone permanent. Lydia became permanent. The temporary arrangement calcified into the structure of their life, the way temporary arrangements always do when one person finds them convenient enough not to revise. She managed the firm. She managed the household. She managed the social calendar and the tax filings and the quarterly investor dinners and the annual compliance review. And the birthday card that went to Reeves's mother in Connecticut, signed with both names, selected and written by Lydia, credited to the marriage. Reeves managed his image. He did this well. She had no complaint about his ability to perform the version of the firm that the outside world needed to see. She had learned to understand it as a kind of division of labor, one that she had accepted without examining whether she had actually agreed to it. She examined it later. After the call, Chapter 3. The mother's lesson. Constance Farrow was 73, and still sharp in the way of people who have spent decades keeping their minds on problems that don't resolve quickly. She lived alone in a townhouse in Cambridge, drove herself everywhere, and called Lydia every Sunday at 9 in the morning, regardless of what either of them had scheduled. She did not like Reeves. She had never said so directly. But Constance Farrow expressed her assessments through the questions she did not ask. She never asked about Reeves's business instincts. She never asked how his board presentations had gone. She asked about the numbers, always. How are the institutional accounts holding? What's the exposure on the discretionary fund? Did the Q3 audit come back clean? She asked about the firm, as though Lydia were the firm, because in her estimation, Lydia was. 2 years into the marriage, Constance had said something at the kitchen table that Lydia had filed, without understanding its full weight at the time. A man who takes credit for a system he didn't build will eventually try to own the system when he realizes he can't replace it. The taking of credit is the first step. Watch for the second. Lydia had nodded. She had poured more coffee. She had not asked what the second step was. 3 years later, she found out. Chapter 4. The discovery. Lydia found the first irregularity on a Wednesday. Not because she was looking. She was running a routine reconciliation of the firm's operating accounts against the quarterly projections she had built in January. A transfer appeared that did not match any approved disbursement, $47,000, routed to an entity she did not recognize, with a memo field that read, "Consulting services rendered." She held the screen for 8 seconds. She did not call anyone. She ran the entity name through the state business registry and found a limited liability company registered 8 months ago in Delaware, with a registered agent she had never heard of and no listed principals. She checked the authorization chain. Reeves's electronic signature was on the transfer approval. Hers was not. She closed the window. She opened a new encrypted folder on her personal laptop, the one that had never been connected to the firm's network. She began to document. Over the next 7 weeks, she found 11 additional transfers, ranging from $22,000 to $108,000. All routed through the same Delaware entity, all carrying the same memo language, all approved by Reeves alone, without the dual authorization protocol that Lydia had implemented precisely to prevent this kind of unilateral movement. The protocol existed because Lydia had watched a managing partner at a previous firm move money for 3 years before anyone noticed. She had built the safeguard specifically because she knew what unsupervised access looked like from the inside. Reeves had bypassed it by creating a secondary approval pathway she had not known about, and granting himself administrative override access to the firm's payment system during a system migration. 8 months ago, when Lydia had been managing a regulatory review and had signed the migration authorization, without examining the permission structure in detail. She had signed it herself. That fact sat with her for a long time before she was able to set it down. She called her mother on a Thursday evening in March. She did not finish the first sentence. "I know," Constance said. "I've been watching the firm's public filings for 6 months. Something shifted in the capital flow in Q2 of last year. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't structural." Lydia was quiet. "How long?" she asked. "Long enough that it's a pattern, not a mistake." "What do I do?" Her mother was silent for 4 seconds. When Constance Farrow was silent for 4 seconds, it meant she was choosing between several fully formed answers. You do not move yet. You build the record completely before you move a single piece. Because when this surfaces, and it will surface, the question will not be whether he did it. The record will answer that. The question will be whether you knew, when you knew, and what you did with what you knew. You need your hands to be completely clean and completely documented. Can you do that? Yes, Lydia said. And Lydia, one more thing. What? Get yourself a lawyer before you tell him anything. Before you tell anyone anything. The moment you engage counsel, everything you say to them is protected. Everything you say to him is not. Lydia hung up. She went downstairs. She made dinner. She set the table. She sat across from Reeves and listened to him talk about a client meeting in New York, and asked follow-up questions, and laughed at the right moments. She felt, sitting at that table, the same sensation she had felt the first time she had traced a financial discrepancy through 6 company layers at her previous firm. The cold, clarifying focus of someone who has found the thread and knows exactly how to pull it. Chapter 5. The architecture she retained Gwen Nakamura on a Monday morning. Gwen was a partner at a litigation firm with a specific practice in financial fraud and corporate misconduct. She was 56, precise in speech, and had the reputation of a person who had seen everything twice and was no longer surprised by any of it. Lydia walked into Gwen's office with a folder containing a summary of the transfers, the entity documentation, the authorization chain analysis, and a timeline she had constructed from the firm's payment records. She set it on the table. She sat down. She waited. Gwen read for 11 minutes without speaking. Then she looked up. "This is not embezzlement as most people understand it," she said. "This is systematic misappropriation, structured to look like legitimate consulting disbursements. Whoever set this up knew what the regulatory thresholds were and stayed under them on individual transactions while accumulating significant exposure across the aggregate." She paused. "Did you know about any of this?" "No, and I can prove I didn't." "How?" "Because I built the dual authorization protocol specifically to prevent unilateral transfers. My documentation of that implementation is timestamped and archived in a system he does not have access to. The fact that he bypassed it is in the migration records. My signature on the migration is there, but the permission escalation he made during that migration is documented in the system log, and I did not request or authorize it." Gwen looked at her for a moment. "You built the safeguard that he circumvented." "Yes. And you have the documentation to prove the sequence." "I have everything." Gwen set down the folder. "Then what you have is not just a personal legal situation. What you have is a whistleblower case. And depending on the clients whose funds were touched, potentially a federal matter." Lydia had known this was possible. Hearing it said aloud by a lawyer in a room with good light was different from knowing it alone at a kitchen table. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you go to the SEC and the firm's compliance authority before anyone goes to you. It means you cooperate fully. It means your documentation protects you because it demonstrates you discovered the misconduct, reported it through proper channels, and did not participate." Gwen paused. "It also means your marriage is over, I know, and your position at the firm. I know that too." Gwen studied her. "Most people who come in here with something like this spend the first 2 meetings trying to find a way to preserve what they have. You came in already past that." Lydia thought about the dinner table, the laughing at the right moments, the follow-up questions she had asked while her husband explained a trip to New York that she now knew had included a meeting with the attorney who was helping him structure the Delaware entity. "I've had time to get past it," she said. They filed the whistleblower report 8 days later. Chapter 6. The compliance review. What followed was not dramatic in the way that television had trained people to expect legal processes to be. There were no confrontations, no screaming, no dramatic revelations in a hallway. There was paperwork. There was a quiet call from the SEC's enforcement division. There were 14 hours of interviews conducted across 4 days in Gwen's conference room, with Lydia answering questions from federal examiners, with the composure of a woman who had been preparing for this specific conversation for 6 weeks without knowing what form it would take. There was a moment, on the 3rd day of interviews, when an examiner asked her to walk through the dual authorization protocol she had designed and explain, in technical terms, how it was supposed to work, and precisely how it had been bypassed. She walked through it for 40 minutes. She used a whiteboard. She drew the permission structure. She explained the migration and the escalation event, and the moment at which her administrative access had been structurally separated from the secondary pathway he had created for himself. When she finished, the examiner looked at his notes. Then he looked at the other examiner. Then he looked back at Lydia. "You designed a system specifically to prevent this, and then he used the one moment you were distracted to dismantle the safeguard." "Yes." "How long did it take you to figure out that's what had happened?" "About 3 hours after I found the first transfer." She paused. "I knew what I was looking for because I designed the system to look for it." The examiner wrote something. He did not show her what. Reeves Caldwell was served with a federal subpoena on a Thursday morning. He had been at the office. Lydia was not. She was in Cambridge, sitting at her mother's kitchen table, drinking coffee from the same chipped mug her mother had always kept on the left hook by the window. Constance did not ask how she was. She asked about the timeline and the legal posture, and whether Gwen had flagged any exposure risk on the whistleblower status. Lydia answered each question. When there was nothing left to cover, they sat quietly together for a while. And the quiet was the particular quiet of 2 women who had both spent their lives in rooms where no one expected them to be the most capable person present. "You did this right," Constance said finally. "I know. I mean, you did it the way I would have. With the documentation first and the emotion after." Lydia looked at her coffee. "I'm still not at the emotion part. That's all right. It will come. It always does. But the documentation lasts longer." Chapter 7. The weeks after Reeves's attorney contacted Gwen's office, within 72 hours of the subpoena, he wanted to discuss the terms of Lydia's cooperation. He used that word, cooperation, in a way that implied she had something to gain from limiting the scope of what she had already reported. Gwen relayed the contact with the expression of a person who has heard this specific miscalculation many times before. "He thinks you're negotiating," Gwen said. "I'm not negotiating. I know. That's the part he doesn't understand yet." He did not understand it for approximately 2 more weeks, which was how long it took for the federal examination to produce a preliminary findings document that Reeves's own attorney was required to share with him. The document outlined the identified transfers, the authorization irregularities, the Delaware entity structure, the client accounts from which funds had been moved, and the timeline that established a deliberate pattern extending 22 months. Reeves called Lydia directly the evening after receiving the document. She did not answer. He called again. She did not answer. He sent a text message that read, "Lydia, we need to talk about this together before it goes further." She did not respond. She forwarded it to Gwen and went to bed. He appeared at the house the following morning. He had a key. She had changed the locks 3 weeks prior. She watched him stand on the front steps for a moment, trying the key twice, then looking up at the door as though it might explain itself. Then he looked at the window where she was standing. Their eyes met. She did not open the door. She waited until he left. Then she called a locksmith to confirm the change was complete in the secondary deadbolt as well, which she had forgotten to update. She was thorough like that. The institutional clients began withdrawing within the month. Not all at once. One by one, quietly, the way large capital moves when it has received information that changes its risk assessment. The firm's managing partner, a man named Theodore Marsh, who had been largely decorative for 3 years, called a board meeting and discovered that the board had very little left to manage. Without Lydia's reporting infrastructure, the quarterly numbers were not where they appeared to be. Without Lydia's client relationships, the calls to reassure the institutional accounts were not going well. Without Lydia's compliance documentation, the regulatory review that had been manageable was becoming something else. Theodore Marsh called her in her 4th week away from the firm. He did not call to ask her back. He called to ask where she kept the compliance archive and whether the auditors had the access credentials they needed for the system. She gave him the information. She was helpful. She always had been. Then she hung up and did not wait for a thank you, because she had stopped waiting for those a long time ago. Chapter 8. The courtroom. The federal proceeding was not a trial in the cinematic sense. It was a hearing. Reeves appeared with 2 attorneys. He wore a suit she did not recognize, which meant he had bought it. After she stopped managing his wardrobe, which meant the cuffs were slightly wrong for his shoulders, in a way that she noticed, and he did not. She sat in the 4th row with Gwen beside her and her mother on her other side. Constance wore a navy blazer and read the procedural documents in her lap, with reading glasses she had owned for 20 years, and refused to replace because they still worked. Brooke was in the 2nd row. Reeves had introduced her as a colleague 6 months ago at a firm dinner. Lydia had shaken her hand and noted the bag, and the particular way she looked at Reeves, and filed it without confronting it. Because the confrontation was not where the leverage was. The leverage was in the documents. Brooke leaned into Reeves and said something, and he almost smiled and then seemed to remember where he was and stopped. He looked across the room. He found Lydia. He looked at her with the expression of a man trying to determine how much damage had been done, trying to read the quiet woman in the gray blazer and calculate whether there was still something to negotiate. There was not. The hearing proceeded. The preliminary findings were entered. Reeves's counsel entered a response. The examiner outlined the enforcement timeline. It was orderly, documented, and inevitable in the way that things are inevitable when someone has built the record correctly. During a recess, Reeves crossed the room. His attorneys watched but did not stop him. He stopped 3 feet from where Lydia was standing. He looked at her. He was trying to perform composure, but the performance had worn through in places, the way a suit wears through at the elbows when it is used too hard for too long. "You reported me to the SEC," he said. His voice was low. You filed against your own firm. Lydia looked at him. Against misconduct in the firm I built, she said. There's a difference. You're going to destroy everything we worked for. She thought about that phrase. Everything we worked for. She thought about the 12-hour days during the first regulatory review, when he had been in New York at a conference, and she had managed the entire examination alone. She thought about the institutional client she had saved by flying to Chicago on 36 hours' notice when his pitch had failed and the relationship was at risk. She thought about the dual authorization protocol, designed to protect him from the kind of mistake he had deliberately chosen to make. Everything we worked for, she said. She did not add anything to that. She let the phrase sit between them, where it could be examined from all sides. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at her the way he had looked at the door that morning, as though she might explain herself. She did not explain herself. She turned back to Gwen and picked up her coffee and waited for the recess to end. Chapter 9. The unraveling it happened in the systematic way that these things always happen when the documentation is complete. The Delaware entity was dissolved by court order. The 22 months of transfers were traced to their destination, which turned out to be two things: a real estate project in which Reeves held a concealed interest, and a pattern of personal expenditures structured to appear as business costs. The client accounts were made whole through a combination of his personal assets and a firm insurance policy that Lydia had maintained, despite Reeves suggesting twice that it was unnecessary. His personal accounts were frozen pending settlement of the civil liability. His bar registration, which had been a point of professional pride he referenced at dinner parties with the frequency of someone who needed external markers to feel substantial, was suspended pending the outcome of the federal process. Brooke was in the picture for approximately 6 weeks after the hearing. Then she was not. Lydia knew this, not because anyone told her, but because she noticed that Reeves's Instagram activity, which she had monitored with the detached interest of someone checking weather data, shifted back to professional content and motivational quotes about resilience. Men like Reeves always posted about resilience when they had run out of other options. He moved to a rental in the South End, a one-bedroom with good light, and a building that was slightly nicer than he could comfortably afford. Because he was not yet able to perform the psychological adjustment that comes with having fewer resources than you are accustomed to. He would get there. Most people did. But not yet. The firm was acquired by a regional group in month 4. Theodore Marsh negotiated a deal that preserved his title and reduced his actual authority to something approximately equal to what his actual contribution had always been. The acquiring group's CFO came in, reviewed Lydia's systems, and sent her a note through her attorney expressing, with the precision of a professional who recognized other people's work, that the compliance infrastructure was unusually well built. She read the note. She felt something that was not quite pride and not quite grief, but was somewhere adjacent to both. She thought about the years of 12-hour days, and the client in Chicago, and the protocol she had designed to protect the firm from someone who had not deserved the protection. Then she set the note aside and went back to work. Chapter 10. What she built next 8 months after the federal proceeding closed. Lydia Farrow opened an advisory practice. She did not name it after herself. She named it after her mother's first piece of advice, the one about systems that outlast the people who ignore you. The firm was called Meridian Compliance Advisory, and within 3 months it had 3 institutional clients and a waiting list. She did not advertise. She did not need to. The people who knew what she had built at Caldwell and Marsh, and what she had been building quietly for 15 years before that, knew where to find her. The forensic trail she had left through the federal process had become, without her intending it, a kind of professional credential more specific than a resume. She was the woman who had designed the safeguard, discovered the breach, documented it completely, and cooperated with federal examiners in a way that was described by the SEC's communications team as a model example of corporate whistleblowing conducted with precision and integrity. She framed the press release, not on her wall. She kept it in a drawer in her desk because she was not the kind of person who needed something on the wall to know it was real. Her mother came to the office on the day it opened. Constance walked through each room with the deliberate attention of someone conducting an assessment, and then sat down at the small table in the conference room and asked about the engagement model and the billing structure and the conflict of interest policy. Lydia answered every question. When there was nothing left to cover, Constance was quiet for a moment. She looked around the room. "You built this clean," she said. "I learned from someone who did the same thing." Her mother looked at her for a long time. There was something in the look that Lydia had seen before, the particular attention of a woman who has watched a person she loves carry a heavy thing and set it down correctly. "He is going to try to reach you again," Constance said, "when the settlement is finalized, when he has had time to construct a narrative that makes him the person who learned something." "I know. What will you do?" "Nothing." Lydia set down her coffee. "There's nothing to do. He can have whatever he needs to have learned. I'm not the person responsible for his understanding of what happened. I was the person responsible for the documentation. The documentation is done." Her mother nodded slowly. She turned back to the room. "Your father would have said you turned out like me." Lydia looked at the window. Through it, the street was ordinary and bright, with a particular kind of late spring light that made everything look a little newer than it was. "I'll take that," she said. Chapter 11. The Sunday morning. On a Sunday in September, 10 months after the hearing, Lydia drove to the house in Marblehead that her mother had bought in 1987 and never sold, the one with the gray shingles and the view of the harbor, and the kitchen that still had the same linoleum it had always had. Because Constance Farrow did not replace things that still worked. She sat on the porch with her coffee. The morning was clear. Boats moved on the water in the unhurried way of early September, when the summer crowds had thinned. Her phone was on the table. On it, in an encrypted folder she had maintained since March of the previous year, was the complete documentation she had assembled. Every transfer, every authorization record, every system log, the timeline, the entity registration, the email thread she had found in a shared folder he had not thought to restrict her access to, in which he had described the consulting disbursements to the Delaware entity's other principal as his personal hedge against the wife who's probably too in the weeds to notice. She had noticed. She opened the folder. She scrolled through it slowly, not with anger. Anger had served its function in the first days after the discovery, when she had sat alone in the office at midnight, with the transfer records spread across 3 screens, and felt the specific betrayal of a person whose attention to someone else had been weaponized against her. That anger had become documentation. The documentation had become a federal case. The federal case had become a settlement and a suspended license, and a man in a South End rental posting about resilience at 2 in the afternoon. On a Tuesday, she scrolled to the last page of the folder. The final document in the timeline was a receipt, a dinner for 2 at a restaurant in the Back Bay, dated on a Wednesday when he had told her he was at a client conference in Providence. She had kept it because it was the first thing she had found, the loose thread that had started everything. She selected the folder. She pressed delete. The phone asked her to confirm. She confirmed. The screen cleared. 2 years of meticulous documentation, gone in a gesture that took less than a second. Not because she had forgiven Reeves Caldwell. Forgiveness was a transaction she did not owe him and had no intention of conducting. She deleted it because the file had done what a file is built to do. It had protected her. It had established the truth in a room full of people who were paid to find it. It had made her position unassailable when his was entirely compromised. Carrying it further would have been carrying him further. She had done enough of that. She set the phone down. She looked at the harbor. The boats continued their unhurried movement. Her coffee was cooling. She picked it up anyway. She thought about her mother's phrase, the one she had heard at 12, and filed without understanding, and carried into every professional environment she had ever occupied. Systems that outlast the people who ignore you. She thought about Reeves, somewhere in the South End, moving through a life that had been quietly sustained by her presence for 8 years, now discovering what the absence of that presence felt like. Not as punishment, not as a lesson she had designed for him, simply as the natural consequence of removing from a structure the thing that had been holding it up. Physics, not revenge. She had not designed his undoing. She had simply stopped being the person responsible for preventing it. She finished her coffee. She stood. She walked inside and set the mug in the sink and stood for a moment in the kitchen with the old linoleum and the hook on the left side of the window where the chipped mug still hung. She thought about who she had been when she had first sat in this kitchen as a professional, 32 years old and newly hired at the firm, already building the first version of the compliance system, already doing the invisible work that everyone would later fail to see. She thought about the 11 transfers and the Delaware entity and the conference room, where she had drawn the permission structure on a whiteboard for a federal examiner who had looked at it and understood immediately what it meant. She thought about the new office, and the 3 institutional clients, and the waiting list, and the press release in the drawer, and the note from the acquiring group's CFO about the unusually well-built infrastructure. She thought about all of it, and she felt something settle in her chest, not with the loudness of triumph, but with the quiet, solid weight of completion. She had built something that outlasted the person who had ignored her. She had built several things, actually, and this time, her name was on all of them. The women who work in silence are not waiting to be seen. They are building toward the moment when not being seen was a choice that belonged to them. And when they step into the light, it is not because the light has finally found them. It is because they have decided they are done with the dark. If this story found you at the right moment, subscribe and come back next week. The next one is already written, and so is the woman in it.